The wind that came down from the northern peaks that late November afternoon did not just blow. It hunted. It tore through the endless miles of dry, brittle grass that covered the valley floor, searching for any warmth it could steal. The landscape was a vast, bruised canvas of browns and grays. The hills in the distance still scarred black from the fires of 3 summers past. Dust, which had been the plague of July and August, had now settled into a hard, treacherous frost that coated the earth, turning the cattle trails into ribbons of iron. Elias Gray pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher around his ears. Though it did little to stop the bite of the air, he sat heavy in the saddle, his body moving with the rhythmic, tired gait of his mare. Bess, before him, a small herd of 20 sullen longhorns trudged toward the creek line. They were thin beasts, their ribs showing like the staves of a barrel through their dusty hides. The creek was their only hope for water on this side of the ridge, and even that was fighting a losing battle against the temperature. Ice had crept out from the muddy banks, choking the flow until only a dark, sluggish vein of water remained in the center. Elias watched the animals dip their muzzles into the freezing water. He did not push them. In this country, pushing an animal too hard was a sentence of death. He was a man of 38 years, though the sun in the war had carved lines into his face that belonged to a man of 50. His eyes, the color of wet flint, scanned the horizon constantly. It was a habit born of survival, not curiosity. To the west lay the jagged teeth of the mountains. To the east, the rolling emptiness leading to the town of Red Butte. And to the north, the timber line that marked the beginning of Cherokee hunting grounds. He lived in the space between, a purgatory of sagebrush and silence. "That's enough, old girl," he murmured to the mare, patting her neck with a gloved hand. "Let us get them back before the sun drops." He worked alone. There were no ranch hands to share the coffee or the complaints. He drove the cattle back toward the shelter of a box canyon where the wind was less cruel, then turned Bess toward the cabin. It was a small structure, hunkered down against a hillside as if trying to hide from the sky. He had built it himself, hauling the timber and the stone, dragging logs until his hands were raw and his back screamed. It was not much to look at, walls weathered to the color of driftwood, a roof of sod and split logs, and a chimney made of river stones that puffed white smoke into the gray evening. But the door was different. It was made of thick oak, heavy and solid. In the center, burned deep into the wood with a hot iron, was a symbol that stopped visitors in their tracks. It was a spiral, tightly coiled, intersected by 2 sharp, crossed lines. It was a mark of the Cherokee, to the white settlers in the valley. It was a mystery or a curse. To the Cherokee, it was a statement. Elias dismounted and led Bess to the lean-to barn. He worked with efficient, practiced movements, removing the saddle and rubbing her down with a handful of straw. He checked his Winchester rifle in the scabbard, then slid it out, carrying it with him as he walked toward the house. The rifle was never more than an arm's length away. Even when he slept, he paused at the door, his breath pluming in the air. His eyes traced the blackened grooves of the spiral. He ran a thumb over the rough indentation. It was a reminder, stark and permanent. He belonged nowhere. He was a traitor to the whites for saving a Cherokee boy years ago, and he was an outsider to the tribe who had branded his door. The mark offered protection, a distant promise that he was under their shield, but it did not offer friendship. It was a debt being paid, day by day, in isolation. He went inside, barring the door against the night. 2 days later, the necessity of flour and coffee forced him off the ranch and into Red Butte. The ride was 10 miles of hard terrain, and by the time Elias rode down the main street, the town was awake and sullen. Red Butte was a collection of false-fronted buildings and desperate hopes, clinging to the edge of civilization like a tick on a dog. Elias tied Bess to the rail outside the general store. The boardwalk thumped under his boots. As he passed a group of men loitering near the livery stable, the conversation died instantly. One of them, a man with a face like a dried apple, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "Indian lover," the man muttered. loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to deny. Elias did not break his stride. He had heard it 100 times. He pushed open the door of the general store, the bell above jingling with a cheerful sound that did not match the atmosphere. The warmth of the stove hit him, smelling of sawdust, pickled eggs, and wool. Mercer, the clerk, was behind the counter, weighing nails for a woman in a bonnet. When he saw Elias, his smile vanished like a candle blown out in a draft. He finished with the woman, speaking in low, polite tones, and waited until she'd left before turning his gaze to Elias. "What do you need?" "Gray," Mercer asked. His voice was flat, stripped of all neighborly cadence. 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of beans, and a tin of coffee. Elias said. He placed a few silver dollars on the counter, and a box of 44 cartridges. Mercer moved stiffly, gathering the items. He slammed the flour sack onto the counter with unnecessary force, raising a small cloud of white dust. He took the money, counting it quickly, and slid the change back across the wood without touching Elias's hand. He immediately looked past Elias, toward the door, as if waiting for a real customer. Elias pocketed the cartridges and hefted the flour. He knew better than to ask for news. He walked out, the silence of the store following him like a shadow. The wind had picked up, biting through his coat. He decided to warm himself with a single whiskey before the long ride back. The saloon was dim, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco. Elias moved to the far end of the bar, keeping his back to the wall. He ordered a whiskey and nursed it, his hat pulled low. At a table near the center of the room, a group of 5 men sat playing cards. They were loud, their laughter sharp and cruel. In the center of them sat Cole Maddox. Maddox was a man who wore violence like a well-tailored suit. He was handsome in a predatory way, with a heavy mustache and eyes that seemed to strip a man of his worth in seconds. He was leaning back in his chair, a cigar clamped between his teeth. "I tell you, boys, it is only a matter of time," Maddox said, his voice carrying over the murmur of the room. "The law does not reach past the creek. That ranch up near the timberline? It is sitting on good water, prime location for moving herds north without anyone asking questions." One of his men, a younger fellow with a nervous laugh, shook his head. "That is Gray's place. They say he is thick with the savages." Maddox laughed. "A sound like dry branches breaking. Savages bleed just like us," he said. "And Gray, he's just one man living in a shack. I do not care who he sleeps with or what spirits he prays to. We take the cattle first, then we burn the rest. By the time the snow flies deep, that land will be ours." Elias stiffened, his hand tightening around the glass. He looked toward the corner where Sheriff Dobbs sat nursing a beer. The sheriff was a heavy man with shifting eyes. He had heard every word. Dobbs looked up, met Elias's gaze, and then deliberately looked down at his drink, shrugging his shoulders as if to say it was none of his business. The law in Red Butte was bought and paid for, or simply paralyzed by fear. Elias finished his drink in one swallow. The burn of the whiskey did nothing to settle the cold knot of anger in his stomach. He was on his own. He slipped out of the saloon, the sound of Maddox's confidence ringing in his ears. The ride home was tense. The sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and gray, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Elias kept his hand near the stock of his rifle, his eyes scanning every cluster of sagebrush. The land felt hostile, holding its breath. As he crested the final ridge that overlooked his valley, he saw them, on the opposite ridge, perhaps 300 yards away. A line of riders stood silhouetted against the dying light. They were not Maddox's men. They sat their horses with a stillness that white men rarely possessed. Cherokee scouts. There were 6 of them. They did not move. Elias pulled Bess up. He watched them, and they watched him. One rider separated from the line, even at this distance. Elias could see it was a woman. She carried a bow across her back, and her hair hung in 2 heavy braids. She sat on a paint horse that looked as wiry and tough as the land itself. She stared down at him. It was not a casual glance. It was an assessment. For a long moment, their eyes locked across the emptiness of the valley. He could feel the weight of her gaze, cold and piercing. There was no wave of greeting, no nod of recognition. It was the look one predator gives another, acknowledging presence, but promising nothing. Then, she turned her horse. The others followed, melting into the timber line like smoke dissipating in the wind. Elias exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. He spurred Bess down the slope. The warning in the saloon was bad enough. The presence of the scouts meant the tension on the border was snapping tight. He reached the cabin as full dark settled. He did not light a lamp. Instead, he stripped the gear from Bess in the dark, his fingers working by memory. He brought her into the lean-to and barred the door. Inside the cabin, he stoked the small fire in the hearth, keeping the flames low so they would not cast a silhouette against the windows. He checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder, and laid the Winchester across the table. He ate a dinner of cold biscuits and jerky, chewing slowly, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the cabin. It sounded like voices screaming in the distance. Hours passed. The fire died down to glowing embers. Elias sat in the chair facing the door, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes wide open. Then, the horses snorted outside. It was not the wind. It was the distinct, heavy sound of shod hooves on frozen earth. The creak of leather, the jingle of a bit. Elias was on his feet instantly, the rifle shouldered. He moved to the side of the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Shadows were moving in the yard. The moon had risen, fat and white, casting a pale, ghostly light over the ranch. He counted 8 men. They were circling the cabin, cutting off escape. He recognized the silhouette of Cole Maddox on a tall black stallion. They were taking their time, confident in their numbers. "Break down the door." Maddox's voice came from the darkness, calm and arrogant. "Drag him out. If he raises a hand, shoot him." 2 men dismounted and approached the porch. They carried torches that sputtered in the wind, casting wild, dancing orange light against the gray wood of the cabin. Elias thumbed the hammer of his rifle back. He would get 2 of them, maybe 3, before they overwhelmed him. He took a breath, steadying his aim at the door. Suddenly, the man closest to the door stopped. He jerked his reins so hard his horse reared slightly. He held the torch up, the light falling directly on the heavy oak door. He stared at the burned mark, the spiral and the crossed lines. "Boss," the man hissed, his voice trembling. "Look at this. What is it?" Maddox demanded. "Riding closer." The man pointed a shaking finger. "That mark. That is a Cherokee spirit mark. This man. He is under their protection." A ripple of unease went through the gang. Several of the men in the back pulled their horses up, crossing themselves or muttering curses. They were hard men, killers and thieves, but they lived in a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. They remembered the stories of the raids, the vengeance the tribes took on those who violated their sacred signs. "It is just burned wood," Maddox snarled. He spurred his horse forward, pushing through his men. "You act like old women scared of a ghost story." "It is bad luck." "Cole," another man said, backing his horse away. "You kill a man with that mark on his door. You bring the whole nation down on us. I ain't riding into a war for a few head of cattle." Maddox spat on the frozen ground. "I am not afraid of a savage scratch. We take what we want." He pulled his revolver, aiming it at the door. His eyes narrowed with calculation. He knew his men were wavering, but he also knew that if he backed down now, his authority would crack. But he hesitated, just for a second. The silence of the house, the strange mark, the cold wind, it gave even him pause. That second was all that mattered. A sound split the night air, a high, trilling war cry that seemed to come from the earth itself. Thwack! Thwack! 2 arrows slammed into the frozen earth, inches from the hooves of Maddox's horse. The stallion screamed and bolted sideways. From the ridge above the cabin, shadows detached themselves from the darkness. A dozen figures appeared on horseback, lined up along the crest of the hill. Their bows were drawn, the moonlight gleaming on the tips of iron arrowheads. At the center of the line was the woman Elias had seen earlier, Ayanna. The gang's horses panicked, milling in confusion. Maddox fought to control his mount, cursing loudly. "Hold!" Maddox shouted, waving his gun. Ayanna rode her paint horse down the slope, stopping 10 yards from the porch. The rest of the warriors stayed on the ridge, weapons trained on the gang. She did not look at the cabin. Her eyes were fixed on Cole Maddox. "This house is marked," she said. Her voice was clear, carrying easily over the wind. It was not a shout, but a statement of fact. Maddox glared at her, his face twisting in a sneer. "Since when do you protect white trash, woman?" "Since the blood oath was cut," Ayanna replied. "Go. If you burn this wood, you burn your own peace. Every rider on that ridge has an arrow aimed at your throat." Cole Maddox. Maddox looked up at the ridge. He saw the grim faces of the warriors. He looked at his own men, who were already turning their horses, their desire for a fight completely gone. He was outgunned, and he knew it. He holstered his gun slowly, making a show of it. "This is not over," he spat, looking from Ayanna to the silent cabin. "You can keep your pet rancher for tonight, but the winter is long." He yanked his horse around and galloped away into the darkness. His men followed, leaving a trail of dust and the echo of retreating hooves. Silence rushed back into the valley, heavy and cold. Inside the cabin, Elias lowered his rifle. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He waited a moment, listening, then unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit him. He stood there, the rifle in the crook of his arm, staring at the woman who had just saved his life. Ayanna sat motionless on her horse. She was studying him. She looked at the way he stood, his feet planted wide, the tension in his shoulders. She saw the scars on his hands, the haunted, hollow look in his eyes that mirrored the emptiness of the land around them. Elias looked back. He saw a woman of fierce, terrifying beauty, her face set in a mask of control. He wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in his throat. In this land, gratitude was a debt, and debts were dangerous. Neither of them spoke. The wind howled between them, whipping the mane of her horse and the hem of his coat. It was a heavy, loaded silence, filled with the weight of history and blood. Finally, Ayanna broke the gaze. She looked at the mark on the door, the spiral and the crossed lines, and then back at him. "You have already cost my people enough risk." "Elias Gray," she said. Her English was accented, the vowels round and soft, but her tone was as hard as the frost on the ground. She did not wait for a reply. She turned her horse and kicked it into a gallop, riding back up the ridge to join her warriors. In moments, they were gone, swallowed by the night and the landscape that was their home. Elias stood alone on the porch. He felt a strange mixture of relief and exposure. He was alive, but the line had been drawn. He turned and went back inside. He sat by the dying fire, the cabin suddenly feeling very large and very empty. Slowly, he rolled up the sleeve of his shirt. On his left forearm, pale against the tanned skin, was a thin, white scar. It was old, faded, but still visible. He ran his fingers over it, the memory of the knife, the blood mixing, the terrified eyes of a Cherokee boy in a burning village. It all came rushing back. The old guilt stirred in his chest, heavy and familiar. But alongside it, for the first time in years, was something else, a faint, unwelcome curiosity about the woman with the braids who had looked at him with eyes full of ice and fire. He stared into the embers, listening to the wind hunt outside, knowing that the storm was far from over. The morning sun that rose over the valley was a liar. It painted the frosted hills in brilliant, diamond-hard light, making the world look clean and new, as if the violence of the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream born of too much whiskey and solitude. But Elias Gray knew better. He stood on his porch, a tin cup of bitter black coffee steaming in his hand, and watched the way the light fractured off the trampled, frozen mud in his yard. The hoofprints of Cole Maddox's gang were frozen into the earth, a chaotic map of intent and retreat. Further out, near the ridge, the unshod prints of the Cherokee ponies were lighter, almost ghostly, but they were there. Elias tossed the dregs of his coffee onto the ground, The brown liquid stained the pristine frost. He could not stay here and wait. The truce bought by the arrows in the dark was fragile, as thin as the ice on the watering trough. He needed to understand the terms of his survival. He saddled Bess, his hands moving with mechanical precision. The mare was skittish, smelling the lingering scent of strange horses and fear that still hung in the cold air. Elias murmured low, soothing sounds, checking the cinch, then sliding his Winchester into the leather scabbard. He mounted up and turned her head not toward the town, but toward the timberline in the north. The ride took him 2 hours, climbing steadily out of the basin and into the foothills. The air grew thinner, sharper. The dry grass gave way to scrub oak and pine, the ground rising in jagged steps of granite and slate. This was the borderland, the place where the white maps ended and the old memories began. Elias approached the Cherokee camp through a wooded creek bed, the sound of the water masking the fall of his horse's hooves on the pine needles. He did not try to hide his approach. To sneak up on a Cherokee camp was a good way to die. As the trees thinned, the camp revealed itself. It was not the thriving village he remembered from his youth, from the days before the wars and the treaties that were broken before the ink was dry. It was a place of hard survival. 20 or 30 tents were scattered among the trees, their canvas gray and patched with deerskin and rough wool. Smoke rose in thin, listless columns from the cooking fires. There were no dogs barking. Even the animals seemed to be conserving their energy. He saw a group of children huddled near a fire, wrapped in blankets that looked too thin for the biting wind. Their eyes, large and dark, followed him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The horses in the rope corral were rib-sprung and shaggy, their coats dull from lack of grain. Elias felt a twist of shame in his gut. While he struggled on his ranch, he at least had flour in his bin and a roof of timber. Here, the poverty was a sharp, physical thing. The shrinking hunting grounds and the encroachment of the fences had squeezed the life out of the season. He rode to the edge of the clearing and stopped. Men began to emerge from the tents. Some carried rifles that looked as old and weary as they did. Others held bows. He saw faces he recognized, men he had seen across the sights of a gun years ago, and men he had once traded tobacco with during the brief, uneasy pieces. A low murmur went through the group. Some of the younger men scowled, their hands drifting to the knives at their belts. They saw only a white man, a former soldier, a representative of the force that had driven them to this cold creek bed. But the older men, the ones with gray in their braids and scars that mapped the history of the frontier, looked at him differently. They looked at his face, and then they looked at the horse he rode, and finally, they nodded stiffly. They remembered. They remembered the blood oath, the debt that had been struck when Elias Gray, wearing the blue coat of the cavalry, had turned his back on his orders to pull a Cherokee boy from a burning lodge. Then the crowd parted. Ayanna stepped forward. She was flanked by 2 others, a young man who looked enough like her to be her brother, and an older warrior whose face was a map of deep creases and weather-beaten endurance. Up close, in the unforgiving light of day, Ayanna was even more striking than she'd been in the moonlight. She wore a dress of dark wool, belted with a sash of woven red and black. Over it, she wore a heavy buffalo hide vest, but it was not her clothes that Elias noticed. It was the scar that ran along her collarbone, visible where her shirt fell open at the neck, a jagged white line that spoke of a knife or a bullet graze. And her eyes, they were the color of dark coffee, and they did not rest. They scanned the tree line, the horses, and finally, him. She watched him dismount. Elias moved slowly, his left shoulder stiff from the cold and the old injury he had taken at Shiloh. He saw her eyes flick to his waist, to the revolver at his hip, and he saw his own hand twitch instinctively toward his belt as a dog barked nearby. They were 2 animals meeting in a cage, both wounded, both expecting to be bitten. "You are bold to come here." "Elias Gray," Ayanna said. Her voice was low, carrying a natural resonance that commanded attention. "I am not here to fight," Elias said, keeping his hands visible. "I came to speak to the elders, to understand. The young man beside her, her brother, by the protective way he stood, snorted. "There is nothing to understand. White man, you are alive. Go back to your cows." Ayanna silenced him with a sharp look. She turned back to Elias. "The council is sitting. They are debating what to do with you. You may as well hear it." She led him toward a large central lodge, the other warriors closing in behind him. Elias felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He was walking into the heart of the fire. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with the smell of burning sage and cedar. Sunlight filtered through the smoke hole in the roof, cutting pillars of light through the haze. 5 elders sat in a semicircle on buffalo robes. They were old men, their faces like carved mahogany, their eyes witnessing a century of loss. Elias stood before them. He removed his hat, holding it in both hands. The debate did not stop because he entered. In fact, it grew louder. One of the elders, a man with one eye clouded white by a cataract, spoke sharply in Cherokee, gesturing at Elias with a trembling hand. "Why do we bleed for him?" the elder demanded, his voice raspy. "He is one of them. He wore the blue coat. He rode with the ones who burned the corn. The mark on his door is old ink. It should have faded when the boy died." Another elder, calmer, shook his head. "A promise is not corn, old friend. It does not rot. The mark was given. If we break our word to the spirits, we are no better than the liars in Washington." Elias understood enough of the language to follow the drift. He stood silent, letting the waves of their anger and their honor wash over him. Then Ayanna stepped into the center of the circle. She did not ask for permission. She simply took the space. "Fathers," she said. Her voice was measured, controlled, a cool stream cutting through the heat of the argument. "I do not trust this man. My husband died by white bullets. My child died in a white fire. I carry the grief in my bones like winter cold." Elias flinched slightly. He had not known. He looked at her back, straight and rigid, and realized the depth of the hatred she must have overcome to save him the night before. "But," Ayanna continued, turning to face the elders, her profile sharp in the smoky light, "we are starving. The soldiers in the fort press us from the south. The town presses from the east. We are trapped in these hills. This man, this Elias Gray, he sits on the boundary. He holds the water at the lower creek. He sees the movements of the town." She turned to look at Elias then. Her expression was not kind, but it was calculating. "He is a wedge," she said. "If he stays, the town cannot take that land easily. If he falls, Maddox takes the creek, and next he takes the timberline. We do not fight for him. We fight for the buffer he provides. The mark binds us. Yes, but survival binds us tighter." The room fell silent. Her logic was cold, hard, and undeniable. Elias cleared his throat. He stepped forward, switching his mind to the halting, rusty Cherokee words he had learned years ago. I have no words to fix the past," he said. The words felt thick on his tongue, but he pushed them out. "I carry the shame of the raids. I cannot wash the blood from my hands, but I am not your enemy now." He switched to English, needing to be precise. "I have water that does not freeze. I have grass in the lower canyon that I cannot use. My herd is small. If you let me stay, if you keep the protection, I will share the water. I will share the grass. And I will tell you what I know of the town and the gang." He looked around the circle, meeting each pair of eyes. "I am alone," he said softly. "I have no loyalty to that town. They call me traitor already. Let me earn the name." The elders looked at one another. A silent communication passed between them, a weighing of pride against hunger. Finally, the chief, a man named Sequoia who sat in the center, nodded slowly. "The mark stands," Sequoia said, his voice like gravel rolling in a riverbed. "You are under our wing, Elias Gray. But know this, a wing can shelter, and a wing can strike. If you betray us, if you lead the soldiers here, there will be no place on this earth you can hide." "I understand," Elias said. Sequoia turned his gaze to Ayanna. "You, daughter of 2 clans. You saved him. You will watch him. He is your burden now. Make sure his loyalty is not just wind." Ayanna stiffened. Elias saw her jaw clench. To be chained to a white man, to be forced to shadow him, was an insult to her pride, but she bowed her head. "I will watch him," she said, "and if he turns, my arrow will be the first." The council was dismissed. 3 days passed before Elias saw her again. The weather had held, a gray, suspended calm that smelled of snow. Elias was working on the north fence line, struggling with a post that had rotted at the base. He was sweating despite the cold, his breath coming in white puffs as he dug at the frozen earth with a spade. He heard the horses before he saw them. He straightened, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Ayanna rode out of the trees, accompanied by her brother, Dakota, and 2 other warriors. They did not ride with the aggression of a war party, but with the casual ownership of people who knew every stone and tree of the land. They pulled up near the fence. Ayanna looked down at him. She was wearing a heavy wool coat today, men's trousers tucked into high boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. "You dig like a badger," she said. It was not a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. Elias leaned on the spade. "Post is rotted. Cattle will push through if a storm comes." Ayanna nodded to her brother. Dakota dismounted, his face sullen but obedient. He walked over to the fence, grabbed the heavy cedar post, and with a grunt of effort, helped Elias heave it out of the sucking mud. Elias nodded his thanks. Dakota ignored him and walked back to the horses. Ayanna dismounted then. She handed her reins to one of the warriors and walked the length of the fence line, inspecting the wire. She ran her gloved hand along the barbs, the devil's rope, as the tribes called it. "You keep your wire tight," she observed. "Most white men let it sag. Loose wire cuts hide," Elias said. "Infection kills faster than wolves." She stopped and looked at the small herd grazing in the distance. They were scattered, searching for the last green shoots under the frost. "Your cattle are thin," she said, "but their eyes are clear. You do not beat them." "No," Elias said. "I do not see the point in cruelty." She turned to him, leaning back against a fence post. Her eyes measured him again, the same way she had inspected the wire, testing for weakness, testing for tension. They stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between them. It was an awkward, jagged thing. They were 2 people who had every reason to kill each other, forced into a partnership by desperation. "The wolves are moving down from the high country," she said suddenly. "We found tracks near the creek 2 suns ago. Big pack. I heard them singing last night." Elias replied, "I keep the calves close to the barn." She nodded. "Good. Cole Maddox is a wolf too, but he does not sing before he bites." "I know," Elias said grimly. Beneath the simple words about animals and fences, a different conversation was happening. She was asking, "Are you competent? Can you survive?" He was answering, "I am trying. I am paying attention." They were sounding out the depths of the water before stepping in. As they worked down the line, replacing staples and tightening wire, the sky began to change. The gray ceiling dropped lower, turning a bruised, angry purple. The wind, which had been a constant nag, suddenly turned into a shriek. Dust whipped up from the dry creek bed, blinding and choking. Tumbleweeds launched themselves across the field like fleeing animals. "It is coming fast," Ayanna shouted over the rising roar. "A northern blow." Elias looked at his herd. They were exposed on the open flat. If the temperature dropped as fast as the wind was rising, the cattle would drift with the storm, pushing miles off course or piling up into a ravine to freeze. "I have to move them," Elias yelled. To the ravine behind the ridge, he ran for Bess. Ayanna was already in her saddle. She shouted a command to her warriors, but instead of leaving, she turned her horse toward the cattle. Elias didn't argue. He mounted and spurred Bess forward. The next hour was a blur of grit, wind, and adrenaline. The storm hit with the force of a hammer. Dust turned the air into a brown twilight. The cattle were confused, milling in circles, lowing in fear. Elias rode hard, swinging his rope, shouting, slapping his leg. Bess danced and nipped at the heels of a stubborn steer. On the other flank, Ayanna was a phantom in the dust. She rode without a saddle, her knees gripping the paint horse's ribs. She moved with a fluid grace that made Elias feel heavy and clumsy. She whistled, sharp, piercing blasts that cut through the wind, and waved her hat. Turning the leaders of the herd, they worked the animals together. There was no need for words. When Elias pushed the left flank, Ayanna fell back to cover the rear. When a calf broke away, she was there before Elias could even turn his horse, driving it back into the safety of the group. It was a dance of instinct, a perfect, unspoken rhythm of two people who knew stock and knew the land. For a moment, amidst the howling dust and the bawling cattle, Elias felt a strange, fierce joy. He was not alone. He was fighting the elements, and he had someone on his flank who was strong, capable, and fearless. They drove the herd into the shelter of the ravine just as the first pellets of sleet began to mix with the dust. The high walls of the cut blocked the worst of the wind. The cattle settled, huddling together for warmth. Elias and Ayanna rode back toward the cabin, their horses blowing hard, heads down against the gale. They reached the lean-to and stripped the horses quickly. The sleet was turning to snow now, driving sideways. "Come inside," Elias said. "You cannot ride back to camp in this." Ayanna hesitated. Her warriors had already vanished into the timber, trusting her to follow or find shelter. She looked at the darkening sky, then at Elias. She nodded once. Inside the cabin, the air was still and cold. Elias lit the lantern, the golden light pushing back the gloom. He knelt and stoked the fire, feeding it kindling until the flames leaped up, cracking and popping. They stood by the hearth, shaking the dust and melting sleet from their coats. The smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and ozone filled the small room. Ayanna took off her hat and shook out her braids. Her face was flushed from the wind, her eyes bright. She held her hands out to the fire, rubbing them together. "You ride well for a soldier," she said, her voice quiet in the intimate space. "You ride better," Elias admitted. He poured water from a pitcher into a kettle and set it on the stove. "I would have lost half the herd without you." Ayanna did not answer. She turned from the fire and looked around the room. It was the first time she had been inside. She took in the simple furniture, the meticulously clean floor, the rifle on the rack. It was a lonely place, a place built for one. Her eyes landed on a small shelf near the window. There, propped against a jar of nails, was a faded tintype photograph. It showed a woman with a gentle smile, wearing a dress with lace at the collar. Ayanna reached out, her fingers hovering near the image. "Your woman?" she asked. Elias moved fast. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his boots heavy on the floor. He reached past her and turned the photograph face down. "No," he said. His voice was rough, shutting a door firmly. Ayanna pulled her hand back as if burned. She looked at his face, seeing the sudden wall that had come down. She saw the pain there, raw and unresolved. It mirrored the hollow place in her own chest where her husband and child used to be. She stepped back, giving him space. "I did not mean to touch your ghosts," she said softly. "They are not ghosts," Elias muttered, moving back to the stove. "They are just memories, and they do not belong here." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of two people realizing they were standing on the edge of a deep canyon of shared grief, afraid to look down. Night fell fully, bringing the storm's true teeth. The wind battered the cabin walls, rattling the shutters. They ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread, sitting at the small table, the lantern casting long shadows. Conversation was sparse. They spoke of the storm, of the likelihood of drifts, of the horses. But every time their eyes met, there was a quick, electric awareness that had not been there before. The shared work, the adrenaline of the drive, the isolation of the cabin. It was stripping away the layers of prejudice and history, leaving just a man and a woman in the dark. Then, the dogs barked. Elias froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Ayanna's head snapped up, her eyes instantly wide and alert. They doused the lantern immediately, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the dying embers of the fire. Elias moved to the window, sliding his rifle from the table. Ayanna was beside him in a second, her movement silent, Through the crack in the shutter, they saw them. Lantern lights were bobbing in the distance, drifting through the falling snow like corrupted fireflies. They could hear laughter, faint and distorted by the wind, and the sound of men shouting to one another. "Cole's men," Elias whispered, testing the perimeter, seeing if the storm made me careless. "They are drunk," Ayanna noted, her voice a breath against his shoulder. "They are brave with whiskey." One of the riders broke away from the group, guiding his horse closer to the cabin. He was shouting something, waving a bottle. He was dangerously close to the corral. Elias raised the Winchester, settling the stock against his shoulder. He thumbed the hammer back. The click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He aimed for the rider's chest. His breathing was steady, but his heart pounded. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his arm. It was Ayanna. Her fingers were warm through the rough flannel of his shirt. She did not push the gun down. Instead, she applied a gentle, steady pressure, guiding the barrel slightly to the left. "Don't kill him," she whispered. "If you kill him now, the town will have a martyr. Cole wants a reason to bring the sheriff. Scare him." She guided the aim toward the snowy ground just in front of the horse's hooves. Elias hesitated. Her hand was steady, her touch radiating a heat that seemed to seep into his muscle, into his bone. He could smell her scent, sage, wood smoke, and the clean smell of rain. She was so close that her shoulder brushed his. He exhaled, trusting her. He squeezed the trigger. Bang! The shot roared in the small room. Outside, the bullet kicked up a geyser of snow and dirt feet from the horse. The animal reared, terrified. The rider dropped his bottle and wheeled the horse around, screaming in panic. The other lanterns bobbed frantically as the gang turned tail, galloping back into the safety of the dark. Elias lowered the rifle. The echo of the shot rang in his ears. He did not move away from the window. Neither did Ayanna. Her hand was still on his arm. The danger had passed, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer about the men outside. It was about the heat between them inside. Slowly, deliberately. Ayanna removed her hand. The absence of her touch left a cold spot on his arm. She stepped back into the shadows. "They will not come back tonight," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in it that had not been there before. "No," Elias said, turning to face her shape in the gloom. "They won't." He could feel the pull of her, a gravity he had not expected and did not want. He knew she felt it too. It was in the way she stood, rigid, holding herself apart, staying here. "It makes sense," Ayanna said, her words rushing slightly. "For the tribe. For the strategy." "Yes," Elias said, "for the strategy." But as he looked at her, watching the firelight play across her face, he knew it was a lie. It was strategic. Yes, but it was also dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with guns or knives. He had let her in, and now, listening to her breathe in the dark, he wasn't sure he ever wanted her to leave. December arrived not with a shout, but with a low, grinding moan. The sky, which had been a vast, open blue in the autumn, lowered itself until it felt as if the gray clouds were scraping the tops of the chimney. The world lost its color. The dry gold of the grass rotted into a slick, treacherous brown mud that froze hard at night and turned to soup at noon. Snow did not fall in blankets yet, but in ragged, angry fits, pellets of hard ice that stung the face and left white scars across the dark earth. Survival became a geometry of wood, water, and heat. There was no time for the luxury of politics or the brooding silence of the previous weeks. The cattle needed hay. The ice on the creek needed breaking. The wood pile needed to be higher than a man's head. Elias Gray and Ayanna found themselves bound together by the relentless demands of the season. At first, Ayanna had ridden back to the Cherokee camp every evening, disappearing into the timberline like a ghost. But as the daylight hours shrank and the ride became dangerous with slick ice, she began to stay longer, sometimes sleeping in the lean-to barn wrapped in buffalo robes, sometimes, when the temperature dropped to 10 degrees, sleeping on a pallet of blankets by the hearth, far from Elias's bed, with her knife under her pillow. They worked with a rhythm that had no need for language. One morning, when the wind was howling down from the peaks. Elias dropped his heavy leather glove while trying to cinch a saddle. His fingers, white and numb, fumbled in the snow. Before he could bend his stiff spine, Ayanna was there. She picked up the glove, dusted the snow from the lining, and held it out to him. Her eyes met his over the worn leather. "You will lose fingers if you are clumsy," she said. Elias took the glove, his hand brushing hers. The warmth of her skin was startling against the cold air. "My hands are getting old," he muttered, pulling the glove on. "They do not mind the mind as well as they used to." Ayanna looked at his hands, scarred and broad. "They are strong enough," she said, and then turned back to her horse. It was a small thing, but it was a bridge. Later that week, when Elias's mare, Bess, decided to be stubborn and refused to cross a patch of suspicious ice, Elias spent 10 minutes coaxing her with sweet words and curses. "She has the spirit of a mule in the body of a lady," Elias grumbled, wiping sleet from his beard. Ayanna, watching from the other side of the creek, allowed a rare, dry smile to touch her lips. "She is not stubborn, Elias, she is just smarter than you. She knows the ice is thin." Elias looked at the mare, then at the ice, and chuckled. "You might be right. I suppose I am the fool standing in the middle of the creek. These moments, the passing of a hammer without asking, the sharing of a strip of dried venison at midday, the quick nod when a job was finished, were the mortar laying itself between the bricks of their lives. They were learning the shape of each other. Elias learned that Ayanna hated the sound of the wind in the chimney because it sounded like screaming. Ayanna learned that Elias hummed hymns under his breath when he was chopping wood, though he never seemed to know the words. One evening, the work was done early. The wind outside was a ferocious thing, battering the cabin walls. But inside, the fire was roaring. The air smelled of pine resin and coffee. They sat in the chairs they had claimed as their own, Elias near the table, cleaning his revolver, and Ayanna on a low stool near the hearth, mending a tear in her coat. The silence was comfortable, until it wasn't. Ayanna stopped sewing. She watched the firelight dance on the metal of Elias's gun. "You handle that weapon like it is part of your hand," she said. Elias did not look up. "It kept me alive long enough to get old." "You were a soldier," she stated. It was not a question. The way you ride, the way you organize the work. You wore the blue coat. Elias paused. He set the cylinder down on the oilcloth. "Yes, I did." "Then why are you here?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. "Why is a man who rode with the destroyers living on a patch of dirt under a Cherokee mark, with no one but a horse and a ghost for company?" Elias looked at her. The question had been waiting between them since the first night she saved him. He looked at the fire, watching a log crumble into glowing ash. He felt the familiar weight in his chest, the stone that he'd carried for 15 years. "I was young," he began, his voice rough. "I thought I was fighting for something noble. Union, freedom, all those words they put in the newspapers." He picked up a rag and wiped his hands slowly. "They sent us west after the war between the states, to protect the settlers. They said, to keep the peace. But there was no peace. There were only orders." He looked at Ayanna. Her face was impassive, but her eyes were locked on his. It was 64. Elias said, "Winter, like this. We were ordered to clear a valley near the Sand Creek. They told us it was a war party, hostiles. They said they were massing to attack the supply trains." His hands began to tremble slightly. He clenched them into fists on the table. "We rode in at dawn. The sun was just coming up over the snow. It was pink. The light was pink." He swallowed hard. "It was not a war party. It was a village. Old men, women, children, they were sleeping. The captain, he gave the order to fire. I hesitated. I shouted that there were women. He struck me with the flat of his saber and told me to do my duty." Elias closed his eyes. He could still smell the smoke. He could still hear the confusion, the terrible, high-pitched screaming that did not sound human. "I fired," he whispered. "I fired into the air. I fired into the ground. But the men around me, they did not miss. I saw a woman running. carrying a baby in a cradleboard. She was shot in the back. She fell into the fire of her own lodge. Ayanna made a small, sharp sound, like a branch snapping. Elias opened his eyes. She was staring at him, her face pale, her jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped. "I broke," Elias said. "I got off my horse. I ran into the burning lodge. I pulled the cradleboard out, but the baby was gone. Dead. But there was a boy, 5 years old, hiding under a buffalo robe, choking on the smoke. He looked at his hands, seeing the blood that wasn't there. I grabbed him. I carried him out. A sergeant, a man I had messed with for 2 years, rode at me, pistol raised. He told me to put the savage down. I shot him. The silence in the room was absolute. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. I shot a man in my own uniform." Elias said, "I put the boy on my horse and I rode. I rode until the horse died. I brought him to the nearest Cherokee band I could find. They were going to kill me. They should have killed me. But the boy, he spoke. He told them." He rubbed the scar on his forearm. "They cut the oath. They gave me the mark. And then they told me to leave and never come back. Because even though I saved one, I had ridden with the monsters who killed the rest." Elias finished. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the confession. He waited for her anger. He waited for her to stand up, spit on the floor, and walk out into the snow. Ayanna did not move. She sat frozen, her hands gripping the wool of her coat. Her eyes were wet, but not with tears of sympathy. They were swimming with a reflection of the same fire he had just described. "You saw the fire," she said. Her voice was a rasp. "Yes, my husband was a peace chief," she said. "We lived near the Washita. We thought we were safe. We had a white flag flying over the lodge." She looked down at her lap. "It was 4 years ago. The soldiers came in the snow. Just like you said, the dawn was gray. My husband ran out to show the flag. They shot him in the throat before he could speak." Elias flinched. "I was in the lodge," she continued, her voice gaining a terrible, flat strength. "I had my daughter. She was 3 months old. Her name was Halona. She had a laugh like a little bird." She looked up at Elias, and the pain in her eyes was a physical blow. I ran toward the river. The snow was deep. I could hear the horses behind me. I felt the heat of the bullets passing. One of them hit the bundle in my arms. She stopped. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest. She did not cry out. She just became heavy. I kept running. I crossed the river. The water was ice. I hid in the reeds. I held her for 2 days while the soldiers burned everything. I held her until she was cold as the stone. She stared at Elias, but she was seeing the riverbank. I buried her in the mud with my own hands. She whispered, and I swore that I would never trust a white face again. I swore I would kill the next man in a blue coat who came near me." Elias looked at her, and he saw the mirror of his own soul. They were 2 jagged pieces of glass, broken by the same hammer, trying not to cut each other. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were inadequate, tiny and useless against the mountain of her loss. Ayanna wiped her face with the back of her hand. She stood up abruptly, the stool scraping against the floor. "Your sorrow does not bring them back," she said harshly. "And your guilt does not fix the world?" "No," Elias said. "It does not." They stood there, the fire crackling between them, the terrible honesty of their stories stripping away all the polite defenses they had built. There was no comfort in the room. There was no redemption. There was only the raw, ugly truth of what they had survived. Ayanna walked to the window and looked out at the black night. Elias watched her back, seeing the tension in her shoulders. He wanted to go to her, to offer a hand, but he knew he had no right. "We are both ghosts, Elias," she said to the glass. "We are just waiting for the winter to finish us." Elias stood up and walked to the fire, banking the logs for the night. "Maybe," he said, "but we are not dead yet." The next morning, the emotional hangover was as heavy as the physical exhaustion. They moved around the cabin with averted eyes, the intimacy of the previous night's conversation hanging over them like smoke. But necessity did not care about feelings. The flour bin was empty, and they were out of salt. "We have to go to Red Butte," Elias said, drinking his coffee, standing up. Ayanna nodded. "I will come." "You do not have to?" Elias said. "It will not be pleasant. I will not hide in the woods while you buy food," she said, her chin lifting. "I am not a fugitive." They rode out an hour later. The day was deceptively bright, the sun reflecting off the snow with a blinding glare, though the air remained bitingly cold. Elias wore his heavy sheepskin coat, his hat pulled low. Ayanna was wrapped in a dark trade blanket, her braids hidden beneath a woolen scarf, but there was no mistaking her heritage. She rode with a straight back, her eyes scanning the horizon. As they entered Red Butte, the town felt tighter, meaner than before. The snow piled against the boardwalks was gray with soot and tobacco spit. Men stopped their work to watch them pass. "Look at that," a man on the boardwalk muttered to his companion. "Gray's brought his squaw into town." The word hung in the cold air. Elias's hand tightened on his reins, the leather creaking. Ayanna stared straight ahead, her face a mask of stone. They dismounted at the general store. A woman walking by with a young boy saw Ayanna and gasped. She yanked the child's arm, pulling him across the muddy street as if Ayanna were carrying the plague. "Don't look at her, Billy," the woman hissed. Elias stepped up onto the boardwalk, his boots thudding heavily. He held the door open for Ayanna. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then walked through, head high, inside. The warmth of the stove was stifling. Mercer, the clerk, was behind the counter. He was cutting a plug of tobacco for an older man. When he saw Elias and Ayanna, his knife stopped. The other customers, 2 farmers and a rancher's wife, fell silent. Elias walked to the counter, placing a list on the wood. 50 pounds of flour, Elias said, his voice hard. 10 pounds of sugar, salt pork, and a box of candles. Mercer looked at the list, then at Elias, and finally at Ayanna, who was standing near a display of fabric. She had reached out a hand to touch a bolt of blue calico, the color of a summer sky. "Don't touch that," Mercer barked. He moved faster than Elias expected, rushing down the counter and snatching the bolt of cloth away. "I don't want your grease on my goods," Mercer sneered, hugging the fabric to his chest. "You want trade goods? You go to the back door. Or better yet, go back to the reservation where you belong." The room seemed to tilt. Ayanna froze, her hand still suspended in the air. The insult was not just rude. It was a physical rejection of her humanity. Elias's temper, usually a slow-burning coal, flared into a white-hot flame. He slammed his open hand onto the counter. The sound was like a gunshot. The jar of peppermint sticks jumped. "That is enough," Elias roared. The silence in the room shattered. Mercer recoiled, clutching the cloth. "She is with me," Elias said, leaning over the counter, his face inches from the clerk's. "And her money is silver, just like anyone else's. You will put that cloth back, and you will speak to her with respect, or I will take this counter apart board by board." Mercer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at Elias's eyes, which were cold and deadly. He looked at the revolver on Elias's hip. It is just policy." "Gray," Mercer stammered. "Folks don't like—" "I don't give a damn what folks like," Elias cut him off. "Weigh the flour. Now." Mercer scrambled to comply. He moved jerkily, avoiding eye contact. Elias turned to Ayanna. She had lowered her hand. Her face was pale, but she held his gaze. There was surprise there, and something else, a flicker of recognition. He had stood between her and the hate. When the supplies were loaded, they walked out. The street was quiet, but eyes were watching from every window. Sheriff Dobbs was waiting by their horses. He was leaning against a hitching post, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "You are kicking up a lot of dust." "Gray," Dobbs said lazily. "I am just buying food." "Sheriff," Elias said, tightening the cinch on Bess's saddle. Dobbs spat into the snow. "Bringing an Indian into town, playing house up there on the ridge. It riles people up. Cole Maddox has been talking, says you are harboring spies. Says he might have to clean up the countryside if the law won't. Elias swung into the saddle. He looked down at the lawman. Tell Maddox that if he comes to my ranch again, he better bring more than talk. Dobbs chuckled. A low, wet sound. You are a fool. Gray, winter is long, and accidents happen. Elias motioned to Ayanna, and they rode out of town without looking back. The hatred on the street was a physical weight, pressing against their backs until they crossed the ridge and the town disappeared from view. They did not speak for the first 5 miles. The sky, which had been bright, began to darken with terrifying speed. The wind shifted, coming from the north with a sudden, violent drop in temperature. Elias looked up. The clouds were rolling over the peaks like a tidal wave of gray wool. We are in for it, he said. Before Ayanna could answer, the snow hit. It was not the ragged pellets of earlier. It was a wall of white. Visibility dropped from miles to yards, then to feet. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of wind and ice. We can't make the ranch, Ayanna shouted over the roar. The horses can't see the trail. Elias knew she was right. To keep riding was to ride off a cliff or freeze to death in the saddle. There is a line shack, Elias yelled, pointing vaguely to the west. Old cattle camp. 2 miles. They turned the horses, fighting the wind that tried to push them sideways. The cold was instant and brutal. It pierced their coats, searching for bone. Elias could not feel his toes. He looked at Ayanna. She was hunched over, her face buried in her scarf, her horse stumbling in the deepening drifts. Those 2 miles took an eternity. Just when Elias thought they had missed it, a dark square loomed out of the whiteness. The shack was little more than a pile of rotting timber held together by stubbornness. The door hung on one hinge. The window was broken, stuffed with old rags that had long since rotted away. They practically fell off their horses. They dragged the animals into the lee of the shack, tying them where the wind was blocked. Inside, Elias shouted. They tumbled into the shack. It was freezing, the air stagnant and smelling of rat droppings and old damp. Snow swirled in through the cracks in the walls. Elias kicked the door shut and jammed a broken board against it. He looked around. There was a rusted pot-bellied stove in the corner and a single, narrow bunk built into the wall, covered with a mattress of mildewed straw. Wood. Elias gasped. There was a small pile of dry wood in the corner, left by some cowboy years ago. Elias's hands were so numb he could barely strike the match. He broke 2 before the third flared. He shoved kindling into the stove, blowing on the tiny flame until it caught. Ayanna was standing in the center of the room, shivering violently. Her teeth were chattering with a sound that filled the small space. We need heat, she stammered. Elias got the fire going, but the stove was small and the shack was leaky. The heat dissipated almost as soon as it was created. It would keep them from freezing to death, but only just. He turned to Ayanna. Her lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue. The cold had soaked through her blanket and coat. We can't stand here, Elias said. We will freeze before morning. He looked at the narrow bunk. It was barely wide enough for one man. We have to share the bed, he said. Ayanna looked at the bunk, then at him. She stiffened. The memory of her trauma, the vow she had made to never let a white man near her, flashed in her eyes. She took a step back. No, she whispered. Ayanna, Elias said, his voice firm but gentle. Look at your hands. She looked. Her fingers were white, waxy. Hypothermia is setting in. He said, the fire isn't enough. We need body heat. If we don't, you won't wake up. She looked at him, searching for any sign of predation, any hint that he was like the men who had burned her village. She saw only exhaustion and a pragmatic fear for her life. Fully clothed, she said, her voice shaking. Yes, back to back. Yes. She hesitated for a long second, the wind screaming outside like a demon demanding entry. Then she nodded. They moved to the bunk. Elias sat down, the straw mattress crunching. He lay down on his side, facing the wall. A moment later, he felt the mattress dip. Ayanna lay down behind him. They were both still wearing their heavy coats and boots. It was uncomfortable, cramped, and awkward. At first, they did not touch, There was an inch of freezing air between them. They lay rigid, muscles locked tight, but the cold was a relentless enemy. Slowly, instinctively, they shifted. Ayanna scooted backward. Elias moved back. Their backs touched. The contact was electric, even through the layers of wool and sheepskin. Elias could feel the shuddering of her frame. He could feel the cold radiating off her. He lay there, staring at the rotting logs of the wall, listening to the wind. He tried to slow his breathing. He tried to pretend this was just survival. Minutes passed. The heat began to build. It was a slow alchemy. The warmth trapped between their bodies creating a small pocket of life in the freezing dark. Ayanna's shivering began to subside. The violent tremors turned into occasional shudders. Elias felt the tension leaving her body. She grew heavier against him, trusting his back to hold her. He closed his eyes. He could smell the wood smoke in her hair. He could feel the steady, rhythmic thumping of her heart against his spine. It beat in time with his own. Sometime in the depth of the night, the wind died down. The silence that followed was deafening. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting a dull, red glow across the floor. Elias was half asleep, drifting in a gray haze. He felt movement. Ayanna turned. She rolled over, facing his back. Then she moved closer. Her arm draped over his waist, her hand resting on his chest, seeking the warmth of his core. Her face pressed against the back of his neck, her breath warm against his skin. Elias stopped breathing. He was wide awake now. Every nerve in his body was singing. He slowly, carefully, turned to face her. The bunk was so narrow that they were practically nose to nose. In the dim red light, her face was a landscape of shadows. Her eyes were open, dark and unreadable. She did not pull away. Elias reached out a hand. He meant to adjust the blanket, to pull it higher around her shoulder, but his fingers brushed her cheek. Her skin was warm now, soft. Ayanna, he whispered. The name was rough, low, a sound that seemed to come from the center of the earth. She let out a breath that shook. Elias. The air between them changed. It was no longer about cold. It was about a heat that had been smoldering since the night she aimed her arrow at Maddox. It was the heat of two lonely, broken people finding the only other thing in the world that understood their shape. They breathed together, synced and uneven. Elias moved his hand to the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Ayanna's hand tightened on his coat. He leaned in. She leaned in. Their lips were inches apart. He could feel the ghost of her kiss before it happened, the promise of it, the terror of it. If he kissed her, everything changed. The line was crossed. There was no going back to the fence, no going back to the polite distance. Ayanna's eyes searched his. He saw the desire there, raw and frightening. But he also saw the fear, the memory of the river, the memory of the fire. She pulled back. It was a tiny movement, just an inch, but it was a chasm. She lowered her forehead to his chest, hiding her face. Her hand clenched into a fist against his heart. Not yet. She breathed. The words were so quiet he almost didn't hear them. Elias froze. He fought the urge to pull her closer, to bridge that gap. He respected the inch. Okay, he whispered. He wrapped his arm around her, not to possess her, but to hold her, to anchor her against the storm. She did not pull away from the embrace. She settled into it, her breathing slowing. Sleep finally took them, but it was a restless, charged thing. They lay tangled together in the narrow bunk, bodies pressed close, hearts beating against ribs, both of them knowing that while they hadn't kissed, they had crossed a line in the dark that the daylight would never be able to erase. The neutrality was gone. They were no longer just allies. They were something else, something dangerous and fragile, huddled together in the heart of winter. The storm had scrubbed the world clean, leaving behind a silence that rang in the ears like a struck bell. The morning sun, rising over the eastern peaks, did not bring warmth. It brought a blinding crystalline glare that bounced off the deep drifts and forced Elias and Ayanna to ride with their eyes narrowed to slits. The ride back to the ranch was a slow, exhausting battle against the snow. The horses floundered in drifts that reached their bellies, snorting clouds of steam into the biting air. Elias led the way, his mare Bess pushing through the broken branches of pine and cedar that littered the trail. Ayanna followed in his wake, her head bowed against the glare. Between them hung the memory of the night in the line shack. It was a physical presence, as tangible as the cold. They did not speak of the way they had slept, wrapped together in the dark, or the moment their lips had almost touched. But the awareness was there in every glance. When Elias stopped to clear a fallen limb from the path, Ayanna watched his hands, the way the muscles in his forearms shifted, with a new, sharp intensity. When her horse stumbled and she corrected it with a fluid shift of her weight, Elias felt a pull in his chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. They were no longer two strangers bound by a mark on a door. They were two people who had shared the warmth of their blood to survive, and that knowledge made the air between them crackle. They crested the final ridge above the ranch just past noon. Elias pulled up, expecting to see the smoke rising from his chimney, a sign of the ordinary life he fought so hard to maintain. Instead, the chimney was cold. "Something is wrong," Elias said, his voice flat. Ayanna moved her horse up beside him. Her eyes scanned the valley floor, her hunter's instincts instantly overriding her exhaustion. "The gate," she said, pointing. The corral gate was not just open, it was smashed. The rails splintered as if hit by a heavy force. The cattle were gone, scattered into the hills or driven off, but it was not the missing herd that made Elias's stomach turn over. Lying in the snow near the barn was a dark shape, a horse. Ayanna made a sound in her throat, a sharp intake of breath that was half gasp, half snarl. She kicked her tired mount into a run, forcing the animal down the slope through the heavy powder. Elias was right behind her, his hand already loosening the thong on his holster. They slid to a halt in the yard. The silence of the ranch was heavy, broken only by the cawing of a crow perched on the barn roof. Ayanna was off her horse before it stopped moving. She ran to the fallen animal. It was a paint pony, small and wiry. It lay on its side, frozen solid, a single bullet hole behind its ear. "It is Dakota's horse," she whispered. Her hands hovered over the dead animal's flank, shaking. "He was supposed to meet us here. He was supposed to be watching the ridge." Elias dismounted and walked to the fence line. He saw the tracks, shod hooves, heavy and deep, churning the mud and snow into a chaotic mess. There were many of them, 10, maybe 12 riders, and, in the center of the mess, drag marks. Someone had been pulled from the saddle and hauled away. He looked up at the barn wall. Nailed to the gray wood at eye level was a piece of split cedar. Words had been carved into it with a knife, the letters jagged and raw, exposing the white meat of the wood. "Send the savages or lose more." Elias felt a cold rage settle in his gut, colder than the wind. He ripped the wood from the wall and turned. Ayanna was standing over the dead horse. She was not crying. She was vibrating. Her face had gone a terrifying shade of gray, her lips pulled back from her teeth. She looked at the tracks leading away toward the foothills, then at the empty horizon. "They have him," she said. "Gee." Her voice was not her own. It was the voice of the woman who had buried her child in the river mud. "They have my brother." She spun around, her eyes wild. She gripped the hilt of her knife so hard her knuckles were white. "I was not here," she hissed, slamming her fist against her own thigh. "I was warm. I was sleeping in a bed while they took him. I was with you." The accusation hit Elias like a whip. She was blaming herself, blaming the comfort they had stolen, blaming the very alliance that had brought them together. "Ayanna," Elias said, stepping toward her. "Do not," she shouted, backing away. She drew her knife, the blade flashing in the sun. "This is your poison, Elias Gray. Everything you touch dies. You brought this to my door." She turned and ran toward her horse, grabbing the reins. "I will kill them. I will cut the throats of every man who touched him." She was frantic, blinded by a mix of terror and old trauma. She was going to ride to her death. Elias moved fast. He caught her arm just as she reached the stirrup, "Let go of me!" she screamed, slashing the knife through the air. Elias didn't flinch. He gripped her wrist, twisting it sharply until the knife dropped into the snow. He grabbed her shoulders, pinning her against the side of her horse. She fought him, kicking and clawing, a whirlwind of grief. "Stop it!" Elias shouted, shaking her once. "Hard!" "Look at me!" Ayanna gasped, her chest heaving. She looked at him, her eyes wide and wet, seeing him and not seeing him. "You cannot ride in there alone," Elias said, his voice low and intense. "You know Cole. You know how he works. He wants you to ride him blind. He wants you to be angry. If you go alone, you die, and if you die, Dakota dies." Ayanna slumped, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had come. She leaned her forehead against Elias's chest, a sob tearing itself from her throat. "He is all I have left," she whispered. "The rest are gone. I cannot put another body in the ground." "You won't have to," Elias said. He released her shoulders and stepped back, picking up her knife from the snow. He wiped the blade on his pant leg and held it out to her handle first. "We are going to get him back." Ayanna took the knife, her hand trembling. I know this land," Elias said. "I know where Cole camps in the winter, and I know how to kill men like him." She looked at him, studying his face. She saw the soldier there, the man who had ridden through fire, but she also saw the man who had warmed her back in the line shack. The conflict in her eyes was painful to witness. Her pride warred with her need. Her people's hatred warred with her heart. "If you ride with me," she said, her voice steadying, "you are riding against your own kind. There is no going back to the town after this. You will be marked. I was marked the day I put that symbol on my door." Elias replied. Ayanna sheathed her knife. She wiped the tears from her face with a rough, angry gesture. "Saddle fresh horses," she commanded, the warrior returning to her eyes. "If you slow me down, Elias, I will leave you. And if you betray me, if this is a trap—" She let the sentence hang there, sharp as a blade. "If I betray you," Elias finished for her. "You won't have to kill me. I'll do it myself." They took the two strongest horses remaining in the corral, a roan gelding for Elias and a dappled mare for Ayanna. They packed light, dried meat, ammunition, blankets, and water. Elias took his Winchester and a second revolver. Ayanna strung her bow and checked her quiver. They rode out within the hour, leaving the ranch silent and empty behind them. The trail was easy to follow at first. Cole's men had not bothered to hide their tracks. They had ridden arrogant and heavy, heading northwest into the broken country where the foothills collided with the true mountains. It was a land of rocky canyons, frozen creek beds, and thorny brush that tore at clothing and skin. The sun offered no warmth, hanging in the sky like a coin of pale gold. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, blowing the powder snow into drifting veils that obscured the ground. They rode in silence, focused entirely on the sign. Here, a broken branch of sagebrush. There, a drop of blood frozen into a ruby bead on a white rock. Dakota's blood. Every time Ayanna saw the red, her jaw tightened. Elias watched her. She rode with a terrifying intensity, her eyes never leaving the trail. He knew she was running on adrenaline and guilt. He forced the pace, keeping them moving even when the horses began to labor. By dusk, they were deep in the Badlands. The canyons narrowed, the walls rising up in jagged spires of red rock dusted with snow. The tracks led into a maze of ravines. "We have to stop," Elias said, pulling his horse up. "It is too dark to track. If we miss a turn, we lose them." Ayanna looked at the darkening sky, then at the trail. "He is out there, in the cold. He is tough," Elias said. "He is Cherokee. He can last a night. You cannot help him if you freeze or break a leg in the dark." She relented, frustration etched in the lines of her face. They found a shallow overhang beneath a limestone cliff, a place where the wind was blocked by a fall of boulders. It was a miserable camp, but it was shelter. They built a small fire, keeping it deep in the rocks to hide the light. They ate jerky that tasted like wood shavings and drank icy water from their canteens. The cold was a living thing. It pressed in from all sides, seeking any weakness in their layers of wool and leather. Elias looked at his hands. The knuckles were raw and cracked from the cold and the rains, blood seeping from the dry skin. He looked at Ayanna. She was sitting close to the fire, rubbing her feet. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion. The silence of the night was vast, filled with the hard, bright stars that looked down with indifference. Ayanna stared into the small flames. "I should have been at the camp," she said softly. "I was selfish. I stayed at the ranch because it was warm. Because—" She stopped, unable to say the rest. "Because she wanted to be near him. I traded my brother's safety for a warm bed." She whispered, "The spirits are punishing me." Elias moved around the fire. He sat down beside her, close enough that their coats brushed. "This is not your fault." "Ayanna," he said, "Cole Maddox is a man who chooses violence. He would have taken Dakota whether you were there or not. If you had been there, you might be dead too." "It would be better," she said bitterly. "Better to be dead than to be the one who failed." "No," Elias said firmly. He reached out and took her hands. She flinched, but she did not pull away. Her hands were ice cold, rough with calluses, strong. Elias covered them with his own broad, scarred hands. He rubbed his thumbs over her knuckles, trying to push heat back into her skin. "Listen to me," he said, forcing her to look at him. "You are not alone in this. You are not carrying this burden by yourself. We are going to find him. We are going to bring him home." The way he said "we" hung in the air. It was a heavy word, a binding word. It wrapped around her like a blanket, shutting out the cold and the guilt. Ayanna looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face, illuminated by the flickering firelight. She saw the stubble on his jaw, the fatigue in his eyes, and beneath it all, a steady, unshakable resolve. He was here. He had ridden into the teeth of winter for her brother. Her composure crumbled. A tear leaked from the corner of her eye, tracking through the dust on her cheek. Then another. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his shoulder. "I am afraid," she whispered, the confession tearing out of her. "I am so afraid." Elias wrapped his arms around her. He held her tight, letting her shake against him. "I know," he said into her hair. "I know." They stayed like that for a long time, the fire dying down to coals. The cold crept closer. They both knew they could not afford another night of shivering apart. They needed sleep, and they needed heat. "We should rest," Elias said gently. He spread his bedroll on the hard ground near the fire. Ayanna laid hers on top of it. There was no discussion this time, no awkward negotiation. It was necessary. It was inevitable. They lay down, pulling the heavy blankets over them. They turned toward each other, their bodies molding together instinctively. Elias's arm went around her waist. Ayanna's hand rested on his chest. The heat was instantaneous. It rushed between them, a sudden and overwhelming relief. But this time, it did not stop at survival. The wind whispered over the rocks above them, a lonely, desolate sound. But inside the blankets, the world was small and intense. Elias shifted, trying to get comfortable on the stone. His hand slipped down the curve of her back, resting at the base of her spine. He didn't move it. His fingers splayed out, pressing her closer. Ayanna drew a sharp breath. She moved her hand, her fingers tracing the buttons of his shirt, then slipping inside to touch the warm skin over his heart. She felt the beat of it, strong and fast. She traced the raised ridge of an old scar on his chest, a bayonet wound from the war. The touch sent a jolt through Elias that nearly stopped his breathing. He looked at her. Her face was inches from his, her eyes dark pools in the shadows. "Ayanna," he breathed. She didn't answer with words. She shifted her hips, pressing herself against him. The friction of their bodies, heavy with clothes but desperate for contact, was a spark in a powder keg. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers rough and tender. She looked at him not as a soldier, not as a white man, but as the only other soul in the universe who understood the language of her pain. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and wood smoke and years of loneliness. It was a collision of grief and need. Elias groaned low in his throat and kissed her back, his hand tangling in her thick braids, pulling her closer until there was no air between them. The kiss deepened, becoming fierce. They devoured each other, trying to erase the cold, the fear, the history that stood between them. They were two people starving, finally sitting at a feast. They moved together in the cold, hidden hollow, the night around them bearing witness to a union that should have been impossible. Hands fumbled with layers of clothing, seeking the shock of skin on skin. The cold air bit at their exposed flesh, but the fire between them was hotter. They made love with a frantic, tender intensity. It was a reclaiming. Ayanna claimed him, marking him with her touch, washing away the memory of the blue coat. Elias claimed her, holding her as if she were the anchor that kept him from drifting off the edge of the world. There were no soft words of romance. There were only gasps, the friction of skin, the desperate need to feel alive in a land of death. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other, the blankets pulled tight over their heads, their breathing slowed, mingling in the small, warm space. Elias held her, his chin resting on the top of her head. Ayanna lay with her face buried in his neck, listening to his pulse. There was no neat resolution. The act hadn't fixed the world. Dakota was still missing. The town still hated them. But something fundamental had shifted. The barrier was gone. Ayanna felt a new, terrifying vulnerability. She had given him everything now. If he died, if she lost him, it would break her in a way the soldiers never could. Elias stared into the dark, feeling the weight of her against him. He felt renewed, stronger than he had been in years, but he also felt a crushing guilt. He had complicated everything. He had taken a woman who belonged to the land he had helped wound. He tightened his arm around her. "I've got you," he whispered into the dark. Ayanna didn't answer, but she pressed closer, her hand gripping his shirt as if she would never let go. Dawn came too early, gray and cold. They rose in the half-light, moving stiffly. There were no apologies. They did not look away from each other. When Elias handed Ayanna her canteen, their fingers brushed, and the contact was electric, heavy with the memory of the night. They looked at each other with a mix of hunger and fear. They were bonded now, for better or worse. "Let's go," Ayanna said, her voice husky. They saddled the horses and rode out, following the tracks deeper into the canyon. 2 hours later, they smelled smoke. Elias signaled for a halt. They dismounted and tied the horses in a thicket of scrub oak. They moved forward on foot, creeping through the rocks and brush, silent as shadows. They crested a rise and looked down. Cole's camp was located in a deep, narrow ravine, protected from the wind by high stone walls. There were 3 canvas tents set up near a large fire. Several horses were picketed on a rope line. Elias pulled a brass spyglass from his coat and scanned the camp. "There," he whispered, handing the glass to Ayanna. She looked. Near the fire, tied to a log, was a figure. He was slumped over, his head hanging down. His clothes were torn, and his face was bruised and swollen, but he was moving. "Dakota," she breathed. "He is alive." There were 6 men visible. 2 were playing cards by the fire. 1 was cleaning a rifle. The others were moving between the tents. Cole Maddox was standing near the horses, smoking a cigar, looking satisfied. "We cannot take them all," Elias whispered. "Not from here. We need darkness." They waited. The day dragged on, an agonizing crawl of time. They watched the camp, memorizing the patrol patterns, the location of the weapons, the lay of the land. They lay side by side in the snow, sharing their body heat, communicating with small hand signals. When night finally fell, the moon was obscured by clouds. It was pitch black in the ravine. "Now," Ayanna whispered. They moved down the slope. Elias moved to the right, aiming for the horses. Ayanna moved to the left, circling toward the log where her brother was tied. The camp was quiet. The men were in the tents or asleep by the fire, wrapped in blankets. Only one guard sat on a stump, nodding off over his rifle. Ayanna moved like smoke. She reached the log. Dakota looked up, his eyes widening. She pressed a finger to her lips. With her knife, she sliced through the ropes binding his hands and feet. Dakota groaned softly as the circulation returned, but he nodded, rubbing his wrists. Across the camp, Elias reached the horse line. He took out his knife and began to cut the picket rope, intending to scatter the animals. Suddenly, a horse whinnied, a loud, piercing sound of alarm. The guard on the stump jerked awake. "Who's there?" he shouted. Elias cursed. He slapped the rump of the nearest horse, shouting, "Yeah!" The horse is panicked, tearing loose and stampeding through the camp. Tents collapsed. Men shouted, stumbling out into the snow in their long johns, grabbing for guns. "Run!" Ayanna screamed, pulling Dakota to his feet. They sprinted toward the edge of the light. Elias was running toward them, firing his revolver into the air to add to the chaos. Cole Maddox emerged from the main tent, a pistol in each hand. He saw them. "There!" he roared. "Kill them!" Gunfire erupted. Bullets whined off the rocks and thudded into the trees. Elias reached Ayanna and Dakota. He grabbed the reins of the spare horse, his roan gelding, which he had brought down with him. "Take the horse," Elias shouted to Dakota. "Go! Ride for the ridge." Dakota hesitated, looking at his sister. "Go!" Ayanna shoved him. "We will draw them off." Dakota swung onto the horse and galloped into the dark, heading up the steep trail toward home. Elias and Ayanna turned and ran in the opposite direction, toward the narrow end of the ravine. "Over here, you bastards!" Elias yelled. Turning and firing 2 shots at the silhouette of Cole Maddox, the gang took the bait, leaving the fleeing boy. They turned their fury on the 2 figures running into the rocks. "Get the horses!" Cole shouted. "Run them down!" Elias and Ayanna scrambled up a steep scree slope, rocks sliding under their boots. Bullets chipped the stone around them. They reached a narrow goat path that wound along the cliff face. They ran, their breath tearing at their lungs. Suddenly, Elias spun around, the impact of a sledgehammer hitting him in the side. He grunted and stumbled, falling to one knee. "Elias!" Ayanna skidded to a stop. She grabbed his jacket. "I'm hit," he gasped. He put his hand to his ribs. It came away dark and wet. "Just a graze. Keep moving." He tried to stand, but his legs were rubbery. He swayed, dangerously close to the edge of the path. 100-foot drop to the rocks below awaited him. Ayanna didn't let go. She hooked her arm under his shoulder, pulling his weight on to her. "You do not fall," she gritted out. "You do not leave me." They stumbled forward, but the path ended. They were cornered. Ahead, a sheer drop. Behind them, the gang was closing in, their boots crunching on the stone. They backed up until their heels were on the edge of the precipice. Elias leaned against the rock wall, blood seeping through his fingers, staining the snow on his coat crimson. His face was gray, but his eyes were clear. Ayanna stood in front of him. She notched an arrow, drawing the bowstring back to her ear. Her face was a mask of fierce, terrifying love. Cole Maddox stepped onto the path 30 yards away, 3 of his men behind him. He smiled, his teeth white in the gloom. "End of the road." "Lovers," Cole called out. Ayanna didn't lower the bow. She reached back with her free hand, finding Elias's hand where it hung by his side. She laced her fingers through his, gripping him with a strength that defied her size. Elias squeezed back, his blood mixing with the sweat on her palm. He raised his revolver with his other hand, though it felt like lead. They stood there on the edge of the world, bleeding and trapped. The wind howled around them, trying to push them off, but they did not move. They held on to the weapon and they held on to each other. 2 defiant sparks in the consuming dark, determined that if they went down, they would go down together. The bullets chipping the stone around them hissed like angry hornets. Elias Gray and Ayanna stood with their backs to the void, the sheer drop behind them offering a death that was only slightly cleaner than the one Cole Maddox was bringing up the trail. "There is no way back," Elias grit out, his hand pressing against the wet darkness spreading on his coat. Ayanna looked over the edge. Below them, perhaps 30 feet down. A steep slope of shale and ice angled sharply into a dense thicket of lodgepole pines. It was a suicide slide, a jagged scar on the mountain that would break the legs of a man or a beast if they hit it wrong. But Ayanna's dappled mare, loyal and terrified, stood trembling where the ledge widened slightly, her reins trailing. "We ride," Ayanna said. She did not wait for him to argue. She grabbed the mare's bridle, jerking the animal's head toward the drop. "Together," she shouted over the wind. They scrambled onto the horse, Elias behind the saddle, his good arm wrapped around Ayanna's waist, his injured side burning as if touched by a branding iron. The mare balked, smelling the danger, planting her hooves on the slick granite. "Go!" Ayanna screamed. She kicked the horse's flanks hard, driving her heels in. The mare lunged. For a heartbeat, they were airborne, suspended in the gray twilight. Then gravity took them. They hit the slope with a bone-jarring impact. The horse's hooves scrambled for purchase on the loose shale, sparking against hidden flint. They did not run, they slid. It was a chaotic, terrifying descent, a blur of white snow, gray rock, and the dark green rush of the approaching trees. "Keep her head up," Elias roared, burying his face in Ayanna's shoulder as debris pelted them. The world spun. The mare fought for balance, sliding on her haunches, carving a furrow through the ice. They slammed into the snowbank at the edge of the timberline, with enough force to throw them both from the saddle. Elias hit the ground hard, rolling until he struck the trunk of a pine. The world went black for a second, then rushed back in a wave of agony. He lay in the snow, gasping, the cold air burning his lungs. Ayanna was already up. She ignored her own bruises, crawling through the deep powder to him. "Elias, I am alive," he wheezed. She checked the horse. The mare was shaken, bleeding from a cut on her fetlock, but standing. It was a miracle born of desperation. They could hear shouts from the ledge high above, faint and angry, but no shots followed. Cole's men could not follow down that slide without killing themselves. "We have to move," Ayanna said, pulling Elias to his feet. He swayed, his vision graying at the edges. The graze on his ribs was deep, and the fall had reopened it. They moved into the deep timber, the trees closing around them like the bars of a cage. The journey back to the ranch was a slow, agonizing funeral march through the snow. It took 3 days. They moved mostly at night to avoid the skyline, huddling in thickets during the day without fire. Elias grew weaker with every mile. The infection set in on the second day, a hot, throbbing fever that turned his skin gray and clammy. He spent half the time in the saddle, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Ayanna walked beside the horse, her hand gripping his thigh to keep him from falling. She was relentless. When he begged for water, she melted snow in her own hands to drip into his mouth. When he murmured that he could go no further, she spoke to him in fierce, sharp Cherokee, ordering him to live, commanding him to take one more breath. "You do not die here," she hissed at him when he slumped forward, his forehead resting on the horse's mane. "You do not leave me alone in this." Back in Red Butte, the truth was being buried under a layer of lies as thick as the snow. Cole Maddox sat in the Golden Steer saloon, a bandage on his arm where a rock splinter had cut him during the chase. He held court at the center table, surrounded by men who were angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame for the harsh winter. It was an ambush. Cole lied, his voice loud enough to carry to the street. "We were tracking rustlers. We found the boy, but it was a trap." Gray and a dozen of those savages came out of the rocks. He took a drink of whiskey, wiping his mustache. "They took my men apart. And Gray, he was leading them. He has turned. Boys, he has gone fully native. He is raiding with them now." The saloon murmured with outrage. Sheriff Dobbs stood by the bar, looking uncomfortable. He knew Cole was twisting the story, but he also knew the mood of the town. Fear was a powerful currency, and Cole was spending it freely. "He is dangerous, Sheriff," Cole said, turning his cold eyes on the lawman. "He has kidnapped a white woman before. Who knows what he is doing up there? You need to put paper on him." Dobbs hesitated. He rubbed his jaw. You want a warrant? I want justice, Cole said. Rustling, murder, treason. Put it on the paper. Dobbs, dead or alive. The sheriff nodded slowly. By noon the next day, the notices were nailed to the church door and the saloon wall. Elias Gray, wanted for murder and inciting violence. Dead or alive. $500. The town of Red Butte simmered. The blacksmith sharpened scythes. The store clerk, Mercer, sold out of ammunition. The rhetoric of clearing the valley began to be spoken openly. No longer a whisper, but a shout. High in the foothills, in the Cherokee camp. The mood was equally fractured. Dakota had ridden in on Elias's roan horse, half frozen, but alive. His return sparked a celebration that quickly turned into a war council. He told them of the rescue, of Elias cutting the ropes, of Ayanna staying behind to hold the pass. He fought for me, Dakota told the elders, his voice cracking. The white man fought for me. Sequoia, the chief, sat by the fire, his face grim. He listened to the young warriors who wanted to ride down and burn Red Butte to the ground. He listened to the mothers who were terrified that the blue-coated soldiers would come from the fort if they attacked the town. If we ride to war, Sequoia said heavily, we lose everything. The army waits for an excuse. But Ayanna is out there, Dakota shouted. She is with him. If the town finds them, they will hang them both. We wait, Sequoia commanded. Though his eyes were troubled, we watch. If the town moves, we move. But we do not strike first. Ayanna and Elias reached the ranch under the cover of a moonless night. The cabin stood dark and cold, the door swinging slightly on its hinges where the wind had forced the latch. They stumbled inside. Ayanna got Elias to the bed, his weight nearly dragging her down. He was burning up, his skin radiating a terrifying heat. She lit the lantern and looked at the wound. It was ugly. The bullet had plowed a furrow along his ribs, but a fragment of lead or bone was still lodged deep in the muscle, festering. The skin around it was angry and red, with black streaks radiating outward. It has to come out, she whispered to herself. She built the fire up until the cabin was sweltering. She took her knife, the one Elias had returned to her, and held the blade in the flames until the steel glowed a dull cherry red. She found a bottle of whiskey in the cupboard. She propped Elias up, forcing the liquid down his throat. He coughed, his eyes fluttering open. They were glassy, unfocused. Ayanna, he slurred. Drink, she said. She tore a strip of leather from an old bridle and placed it between his teeth. Bite down. Do not let go. She poured the rest of the whiskey over the wound. Elias arched his back, a guttural sound tearing from his throat. Ayanna took a breath. She steadied her hands. She could not be the woman who loved him right now. She had to be the butcher. She had to hurt him to save him. She pressed the hot knife into the wound. The smell of cauterized flesh filled the small room. Elias screamed, a sound that was muffled by the leather but still pierced Ayanna's heart. She dug for the shard, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. I'm sorry, Elias gasped, spitting the leather out as he thrashed. I'm sorry. The baby, the fire. He was back in the raid. He was back in the snow of Sand Creek. It was not you, Ayanna said, her voice shaking as she worked. Stay with me, Elias. I didn't want to shoot, Elias babbled, sweat pouring off his face. I am sorry. Ayanna, I am sorry. He was apologizing to her, to the dead woman, to the land itself. His guilt was bleeding out of him with the infection. Got it, Ayanna grunted. She flicked the knife, and a jagged piece of metal clattered onto the floorboards. She quickly packed the wound with a poultice of sage and moss she had carried in her pouch, binding it tight with strips of cloth. Elias slumped back, unconscious, his breathing ragged. Ayanna sat by the bed all night. She wiped the blood from her hands, then wiped the sweat from his forehead. She talked to him while the wind howled outside. You are not that man, she whispered fiercely into the dark. You are the man who cut my brother's ropes. You are the man who held me in the line shack. You chose differently. She laid her head on his chest, listening to the struggle of his heart. You chose me, she said, so you do not get to die. By morning, the fever broke. Elias woke to the smell of wood smoke and the feeling of a cool hand on his chest. He opened his eyes. The room was dim, the fire low. Ayanna was sitting on the floor beside the bed, her head resting near his shoulder, asleep. He moved his hand, his fingers brushing her hair. She woke instantly, her eyes snapping to his. You are cool, she said, touching his forehead. The fire is gone. Elias tried to sit up but groaned. The pain in his side was sharp, but clean. The throbbing sickness was gone. You dug it out, he said, his voice a dry rasp. I had to, she said. You were trying to leave. Elias looked at her. Her face was drawn, dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted, but she was there. She had stayed. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers, rough and calloused, entwined with hers. Thank you, he said. Ayanna looked at their joined hands. She did not pull away. You talked in your sleep, she said quietly. You asked for forgiveness. Did I get it? Ayanna looked at him. Yes, you got it. The silence in the room was tender, heavy with the things they had survived. Elias squeezed her hand. I have been shot at, frozen, and starved, he said softly. But this, looking at you right now, it scares me more than any of it. Why? Ayanna asked. Because I love you, he said, and I don't know how to keep you safe in this world. Ayanna let out a breath that was half a sob. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against their joined hands. I never thought I would say this to a white man, she whispered. I never thought I would want to, but I love you. Elias. The confession hung in the air, fragile and absolute. Their peace lasted exactly 1 hour. The sound of horses, many horses, broke the morning quiet. Ayanna was at the window in a second. Her body went rigid. It is them, she said. Elias forced himself up. He grabbed the bedpost. Swaying, he limped to the window. Outside, the yard was full of men. Sheriff Dobbs sat on his horse in the center, looking grim. Cole Maddox was beside him, a smug grin on his face. Behind them were 20 townsmen, armed with shotguns and rifles. They formed a semicircle around the cabin, blocking all escape. Elias Gray, the sheriff shouted. Come out with your hands up. Elias looked at Ayanna. This is it, he said. He reached for his gun belt, buckling it on despite the pain. He checked the Winchester. Ayanna grabbed her bow. She strung it with a snap of the wrist. Stay here, Elias said. No, she replied. We go together. Elias opened the door. He stepped out onto the porch, Ayanna at his right hand, above their heads. The burned Cherokee mark, the spiral and crossed lines, stood out dark against the weathered wood. Elias leaned against the doorframe, using it to hold himself upright. He looked pale. Death warmed over, but his eyes were steady. What do you want? Dobbs, Elias called out. We have a warrant. Gray, Dobbs said, holding up a piece of paper. Murder, kidnapping, treason, lies, Elias said. Cole Maddox rode his horse forward a few paces. He spat on the ground. Save your breath, traitor. The law has come to collect. And we are taking the girl, too. She is an accomplice. Cole pointed his revolver at the mark on the door. And that mark, it don't mean a damn thing anymore. This is white man's land now. That wood is just kindling. He looked at the crowd. I say we hang him here, Cole shouted. Save the judge the trouble. A murmur of agreement went through the posse. Men raised their rifles. The air was tight, ready to snap. Elias shifted his weight, moving slightly in front of Ayanna. He would take the first bullet. Suddenly, a whistling sound cut the air. Thud, thud, thud. 3 arrows slammed into the ground, forming a line between the posse and the porch. The townsmen's horses reared. Men shouted in alarm. On the ridge above the cabin, silhouettes appeared. Dakota stood tall, his bow drawn. Beside him were 10 Cherokee warriors, their face painted for war. Hold fire, Dobbs screamed, panic in his voice. The standoff was absolute. 20 guns against 10 bows, but the Cherokee had the high ground, and they had the rage. One shot would turn the ranch into a slaughterhouse. Cole Maddox's face turned purple. "Shoot them!" he roared. "Shoot the savages!" But the townsmen wavered. They were farmers and shopkeepers, not soldiers. They saw the arrows, and they saw the look in the warriors' eyes. "Wait!" a voice called out from the back of the posse. A woman pushed her horse through the line of men. It was Mrs. Gable. The widow Elias had helped fix a wagon wheel 2 months prior. She looked at Elias, pale and bleeding on the porch, and Aiyana standing fierce beside him. "This ain't right. Mrs." Gable said, her voice shaking but loud. "I know Elias Gray. He is a decent man. He helped me when no one else would. And that girl," she pointed at Aiyana, "I saw her in town. She stopped a runaway horse that would have trampled the Miller boy. She risked her neck. These aren't murderers." Another man, the father of the boy Aiyana had saved, lowered his shotgun. "She is right," he muttered. "That girl saved my Billy." Cole Maddox turned on them. "Shut your mouths! You are defending traitors! I'm defending the law! Mrs. Gable snapped. "Not a lynching." Sheriff Dobbs saw his control slipping. He saw the warriors on the ridge, fingers itching on bowstrings. He saw the doubt in his own men. "Enough," Dobbs shouted. He looked at Elias. "I can't walk away. Gray, the warrant is signed, but I won't have a hanging in the yard." He took a deep breath. "You come with me to town. We will have a hearing, a proper one. The judge comes through next week. Until then, you are in my custody." "And the girl?" Elias asked. She can go back to her people." Dobbs said. "No." Aiyana said. Her voice carried across the yard. "Clear as a bell. I go where he goes." Cole laughed harsh and loud. "Then you can rot in the cell with him." The warriors on the ridge shifted. Dakota shouted down in Cherokee, warning Aiyana not to go. She looked up at her brother and shook her head once. She would not leave Elias. Dobbs looked at the warriors. "If they come quietly," Dobbs yelled to the ridge, "no one gets hurt. The Cherokee stay out of town. We settled this in the court. It was a thin, fragile promise. Everyone knew a courtroom in Red Butte was likely just a slow road to a rope, but it was the only way to stop the blood from spilling right there in the snow." Elias looked at Aiyana. "They will kill us," he whispered. "Maybe," she said, "but not today." She lowered her bow. "We are coming," Elias called out. He stepped off the porch. He stumbled, his leg giving way. Aiyana caught him. She wrapped her arm around his waist, taking his weight. They walked to the horses. The posse parted, leaving a lane for them. The warriors on the ridge watched, arrows still nocked, trusting nothing. They mounted up, Aiyana helping Elias into the saddle before mounting her own mare. The procession back to town was slow and tense. Elias and Aiyana rode in the center, surrounded by armed men. The sky was a flat, oppressive gray. As they rode, their horses bumped shoulders. Elias looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, buried deep behind the mask of the warrior. He reached out his hand, letting it hang by his side. Aiyana reached out. Her fingers brushed his. It was a fleeting touch, barely visible to the men around them, but it carried the weight of everything they had said in the cabin. "If this goes wrong," Elias whispered, looking straight ahead. "If the crowd turns, you run, you save yourself." Aiyana looked at him. She looked at the sheriff, at Cole's angry back, at the long road to Red Butte. "No," she whispered back. She laced her fingers through his for a second, squeezing hard before letting go. "I am not leaving you. Elias." We faced the hate together. They rode on toward the town, two small figures against the vast, indifferent landscape, riding into the heart of the enemy with nothing but their fragile, stubborn love to shield them. The church in Red Butte was not a place of worship that day. It was a kiln where hatred was being fired into something hard and brittle. The pews, usually reserved for Sunday hymns and quiet prayers, were packed shoulder to shoulder with men who smelled of stale tobacco, unwashed wool, and nervous sweat. The air was thick, suffocatingly hot despite the winter chill outside, and it buzzed with a low, ugly murmur that sounded like a hive of agitated wasps. Sheriff Dobbs stood behind the pulpit, his face slick with perspiration. He looked small against the wooden cross that hung on the wall behind him. A man whose authority had been eroded by fear until only the badge remained. To his right, sitting on a high stool like a king on a throne, was Cole Maddox. Elias Gray stood in the center aisle, his hands bound behind his back with a rough hemp rope. He swayed slightly, the fever having left him weak, but his head was high. Ayanna stood beside him. She was not bound, but she was trapped just the same, hemmed in by the hostile glares of 100 eyes. "This court is now in session," Dobbs announced, his voice cracking. "We are here to weigh the charges against Elias Gray." There was no judge. There was no jury. There was only the mob. Cole Maddox stood up. He walked to the edge of the pulpit, looking down at the crowd with the practiced ease of a predator. "We all know why we are here," Cole said, his voice booming off the rafters. "This man, this traitor, he has been plotting against Red Butte for years. He feeds the savages. He hides them. And now, he rides with them." Cole pointed a finger at Elias. "My men saw him." Cole lied, his eyes unblinking. "We were tracking the rustlers who took your cattle. We found them in the high canyon. And who was leading them? Who was giving the orders to butcher good white men? It was Elias Gray." A roar of outrage went up from the pews. Men shook their fists. "Liar!" Elias shouted, his voice rasping. "You kidnapped a boy! You tortured him!" His words were swallowed by the noise. Cole smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. "He admits he was there," Cole shouted over the din. "He admits he was with the Cherokee. And look at who stands beside him." He gestured to Ayanna. "A squaw." Cole spat the word like a curse. "A spy. She has been poisoning his mind. And now she comes into our town, bold as brass, expecting us to bow down." Ayanna stepped forward. Her face was set in stone, her dignity a sharp contrast to the chaotic anger around her. "I came for justice," she said, her voice clear and piercing. "My brother was taken by this man. My people want peace, but you push us to war. Shut up!" A man in the front row screamed. Suddenly, a hand moved in the crowd. A stone, jagged and heavy, flew through the air. It struck Ayanna high on the cheekbone. The impact was sickeningly loud. Ayanna stumbled back, a gasp escaping her lips. Blood welled up instantly, bright red against her skin, running down her neck to stain the collar of her dress. Elias lunged. He did not think. He simply moved, a snarl tearing from his throat. He threw his shoulder into the man nearest him, trying to reach the coward who had thrown the stone. "Don't touch her," Elias roared. 3 men grabbed him, slamming him back against a pillar. Elias struggled, his bound hands useless, his eyes burning with a helpless, killing rage. He wanted to tear the throat out of every man in the room, but he knew that if he fought too hard, if he lost control, they would kill Ayanna right there on the floorboards. "Order!" Sheriff Dobbs banged his gavel, looking terrified that the lynching was starting too early. "Order! Damn it!" The room settled into a heavy, panting silence. Ayanna stood straight again, wiping the blood from her cheek with the back of her hand. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Cole Maddox, her eyes promising a reckoning. "Is there anyone who speaks for this man?" Dobbs asked, looking around the room, clearly hoping for silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The fear of Cole Maddox was a heavy blanket. Then, a scraping of wood. Mrs. Gable, the widow, stood up near the back. She was a small woman, worn down by the frontier, but her jaw was set. "I will speak," she said. Her voice shook, but she did not sit down. "Elias Gray fixed my wagon when I was stranded on the pass," she said. "He asked for no money. He shared his water. And that girl," she pointed a trembling finger at Ayanna. "I saw her in the street. The Miller boy. The horse was going to crush him. She didn't hesitate. She ran in. She is the reason that boy is alive today." She looked at the men around her. "Are we so blind with hate that we kill the people who save our children?" There was a murmur of unease. Some men looked at their boots. The father of the Miller boy stood up slowly, removing his hat. "She is right," he muttered. "The girl saved my Billy. I cannot stand by and watch her be hurt." "Sit down!" Cole barked. He walked down the aisle, looming over the Miller boy's father. "You want to side with them?" Cole threatened, his hand resting on his gun. "You want to be branded a traitor too? You want your barn to burn next?" The threat was naked and effective. The man paled. He looked at Ayanna, then at his wife beside him. Slowly, shamefaced, he sat back down. "Mrs." Gable remained standing for a moment longer, defiant, before her neighbor pulled her down by her sleeve, whispering a warning. The spark of decency had been struck, but fear stomped it out. Dobbs saw the tide turn back. He wanted this over. "I've heard enough," Dobbs said quickly. "The testimony of Mr. Maddox stands. Elias Gray, you are found guilty of treason and murder." The gavel banged. It sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. "Sentence is death by hanging, carried out immediately." A cheer went up, wild and bloodthirsty. Hands grabbed Elias, dragging him toward the double doors. The sunlight that spilled into the church was blinding, a sharp contrast to the gloom inside. They dragged him out into the dusty square. In the center, a makeshift gallows had been erected, a rope thrown over the sturdy limb of a cottonwood tree, a barrel placed beneath it. The air outside was freezing, the wind cutting through coats, but the crowd didn't seem to feel it. They were heated by the spectacle. Outside the town, on the ridge that overlooked the valley, a line of statues watched. Dakota and the Cherokee warriors sat on their horses, silent and immobile. "They can see us," a young warrior whispered to Dakota. "Why do we not ride?" "We wait," Dakota said, his knuckles white on his bow. "The chief said we wait for the first blood. If we ride now, the soldiers come tomorrow, but they are going to kill him," the warrior argued. Dakota watched the square, his heart hammering. "Wait," he commanded, though every instinct screamed to charge. In the square, they shoved Elias onto the barrel. The rough hemp was slipped over his head. The knot tightened behind his ear. The scratch of the rope was a terrible, final sensation. Elias looked out at the crowd. He looked at the sky, wide and pale blue. He looked at the distant hills where his ranch lay empty. Then he looked at Ayanna. She had been pushed to the front of the circle. Blood was still drying on her cheek. She looked at him, and he saw the moment she decided that she would not let this happen. She pushed through the line of men. "Stop!" she screamed. The crowd quieted, startled by her ferocity. Ayanna walked to the base of the gallows. She turned to face the town. "You call yourselves men of God?" she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. "You hang a man who has more honor in his little finger than all of you combined." She pointed at the hills. "He saved my brother. He rode into the ice and the dark to save a Cherokee boy from white murderers. He bled for us, and he bled for you." She looked at the faces in the crowd, searching for the humanity she knew must be there. "His blood will not wash away your fear," she shouted. "It will only add to the river that is already drowning this land. If you kill him, you kill the best part of yourselves." For a second, the town held its breath. Her words hung in the air, shaming them. Cole Maddox saw the hesitation. He saw his victory slipping. He crossed the distance in 3 strides. He grabbed Ayanna by her long hair, jerking her head back. "Shut your mouth, savage whore!" Cole roared. He jammed the barrel of his revolver against her temple. "You want to join him?" Cole shouted to the crowd. "We should hang them together. 2 traitors on one branch." The sight of the gun against her head, the look of pain on her face, snapped something inside Elias. The rope, the barrel, the odds. None of it mattered. "Ayanna!" Elias screamed. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He launched himself off the barrel, not away from the rope, but toward Cole. The sudden movement threw Cole off balance. He turned, the gun slipping from Ayanna's temple. He fired in panic. Bang! The bullet meant for Ayanna slammed into Elias's chest. The impact stopped him mid-air. He crumpled, hitting the ground hard, dragging the rope down with him as the branch overhead creaked and snapped under the sudden, violent force. "Elias!" Ayanna shrieked. The gunshot was the signal the ridge had been waiting for. From the hills, a war cry erupted. Chilling and ancient, arrows began to rain down on the outskirts of the crowd, thudding into wagon beds and fence posts. "The Cherokee!" Someone screamed. "They are attacking! Chaos exploded. The crowd disintegrated into a panicked mob. People ran for cover, trampling one another. Men pulled guns and fired wildly at the hills. Cole Maddox stood over Elias, shocked that the man had taken the bullet. He raised his gun to finish him. Ayanna moved. She dropped to her knees beside Elias, her hands slick with his blood. Her eyes fell on his holster. The posse had taken his rifle, but in the confusion, they had left the revolver on his hip. She ripped the gun from the leather. Cole turned the barrel toward her. Ayanna rolled, coming up onto one knee. The world narrowed down to a single point, the man who had brought death to her door. She did not feel the cold. She did not hear the screams of the town. She felt an absolute, icy calm. Cole fired. The dirt exploded next to her knee. Ayanna squeezed the trigger. Bang! Cole Maddox jerked as the bullet took him in the shoulder. He staggered back, his eyes going wide with disbelief. He tried to raise his gun again. Bang! Ayanna's second shot was center mass. It hit him in the chest, punching the breath and the life out of him. Cole dropped to his knees. He looked at her, mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. Then he fell forward, face down in the dust of the town he had tried to rule. Sheriff Dobbs saw Cole fall. He saw the Cherokee warriors riding down the main street, horses skidding on the dirt, bows drawn. He saw the townspeople fleeing. Dobbs turned and ran. He made it as far as the livery stable before he was cut off. It was not the Cherokee who stopped him. It was the Miller boy's father and 3 other townsmen. They stood in his path, shotguns leveled. "Get out of the way!" Dobbs screamed, clutching his money belt. "You aren't going anywhere." "Sheriff," the Miller boy's father said, "you let this happen." Dobbs went for his gun, but a Cherokee arrow hissed through the air and pinned his sleeve to the stable door. He shrieked, dropping his weapon. He was surrounded by a mix of warriors and citizens. There was no trial for Sheriff Dobbs. He was dragged to the jailhouse and thrown into the cell, stripped of his badge, to wait for a circuit judge who would finally hear the real truth. The shooting died down as quickly as it had started. The Cherokee did not burn the town. They held the street, their horses restless, arrows nocked but undrawn. The townspeople who had not fled stood watching them. The silence returned, heavier now, weighted with the dead. In the center of the square, Ayanna dropped the gun. She crawled to Elias. He was lying on his back, staring up at the cottonwood branches. His shirt was soaked in red. "Elias," Ayanna whispered, her voice breaking. She lifted his head into her lap. She pressed her hands over the wound, trying to keep the life inside him. "Elias, look at me! Look at me!" Elias's eyes fluttered. He focused on her face. He saw the blood on her cheek, the tears tracking through the dust. Did I get him?" he wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. "You saved me," she sobbed, rocking him. "You foolish, stubborn man. You took the bullet. I couldn't—" "Let him touch you," Elias whispered. "Shh," she said, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Save your breath." She looked around. Dakota rode up, jumping from his horse. He looked at Elias, then at his sister. "He is bad." Dakota said, "Help me," Ayanna commanded. "We take him home." As they lifted him, Elias groaned. His hand groped blindly until it found Ayanna's arm. "Ayanna, I am here," she said, leaning close to his lips. "I love you." He breathed. The words were faint, carried away by the wind, but they were there. "I love you." She wept, the words torn from her chest. "You are my heart. Elias, you do not leave me. I am home," he whispered, and then his eyes closed. Days turned into a week. The winter deepened, burying the land under 3 feet of snow. The world went quiet, muted by the white blanket. In the cabin, the fire never went out. Elias Gray lay in his bed, pale and gaunt, but alive. The bullet had missed his heart by an inch, breaking a rib and puncturing a lung, but he was made of rawhide and stubbornness. Ayanna sat beside him. She was sewing a quilt. Her hands, which could draw a bow with deadly force, moved with gentle precision. She was stitching together squares of fabric, some from old army wool, some from trade blankets, some from deerskin. Elias opened his eyes. He watched her for a long time. "You are still here," he said, his voice stronger than it had been. Ayanna looked up, a smile, tired but genuine, touched her lips. "The snow is too deep to ride." She teased. "I'm stuck with you." Elias smiled back. It hurt his ribs, but it was worth it. A knock came at the door. Ayanna stood up. She did not reach for a weapon. She opened the door. Outside stood Sequoia, the chief, wrapped in a buffalo robe. Beside him was Mrs. Gable and the new acting sheriff, the Miller boy's father. They came in, stamping the snow from their boots. The cabin felt crowded. "We have spoken," Sequoia said, his voice rumbling. "The town and the tribe. Mrs." Gable nodded. "We are tired of the fighting. Elias, Cole is gone. Dobbs is gone. The hate, well, it ain't gone, but it's tired too. We have an agreement. The acting sheriff said the town will respect the hunting lines. No more fences north of the creek. And the Cherokee will allow grazing in the lower valley during the deep snow," Sequoia added. They looked at Elias and Ayanna. "And this place?" Sequoia asked. "It stays," Ayanna said firmly. She moved to stand beside the bed, her hand resting on Elias's shoulder. "This is Cherokee land," she said, "and it is white land. It is both." Sequoia studied her. He saw the way she stood, the way she touched the white man. He saw the resolve in her eyes that no council could break. "So be it," the chief said. "It is a boundary place, a place of the middle." The delegation left. The door closed, shutting out the cold. Elias looked at the door. The mark, the spiral and crossed lines, was still there, dark against the wood. "They accepted it," Elias said, sounding surprised. "They accept that they cannot move us," Ayanna corrected. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. She picked up the quilt. "My brother says he will visit when the snow melts." She said, "He wants to learn to shoot the Winchester." Elias chuckled. "I will teach him. If he teaches me how to track without snapping every twig in the forest." They fell silent. The fire popped. Ayanna spread the quilt over him. It was a chaotic, beautiful map of colors. Blue wool next to red trade cloth, leather stitched to cotton. Two histories, cut apart and sewn back together into something warm. Elias ran his hand over the fabric. "You are staying," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am staying," she answered. She lay down beside him, careful of his ribs. She rested her head on his shoulder. "People will talk," Elias said. "They will stare. It will never be easy." "I do not care about easy," Ayanna whispered. "I care about this." She traced the line of his jaw. "We will have children," she said suddenly. Elias froze. "Children?" "Yes, they will have your gray eyes and my dark skin. They will speak English and Cherokee. They will know the stories of the stars and the stories of the Bible." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce with hope. "They will be the bridge, Elias, like this cabin." Elias felt a lump in his throat. He thought of the dead baby in the fire. He thought of Ayanna's lost daughter. He thought of the pain that had brought them here. And then he looked at the woman in his arms. The woman who had pulled him from the edge of the grave. "Yes," he whispered. "A bridge. Outside. The wind howled across the empty, frozen land. It battered the walls and stripped the trees. But inside, the fire cast a soft, steady glow on their faces. Their desire was no longer the desperate, clawing thing of the line shack. It was a steady flame, fed by trust and tenderness. It was a stubborn, fragile hope that refused to die. The story closed not with a gunfight, but with a quiet image. The camera of the mind pulled back, out of the cabin, into the cold night. It showed the small structure glowing in the vast darkness of the American West. It focused on the front door, where the Cherokee mark, the sign of protection, stood stark and black against the weathered wood. Beyond it, the sky was endless, filled with a million hard, bright stars. The land was still harsh, the prejudice still lingered in the shadows. But in that small cabin at the edge of two worlds, love had claimed a victory. It was fragile. Yes, but it was enduring. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the snow and the fire with Elias and Ayana, and I am grateful you traveled this trail with me. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of grit, history, and the human heart. I encourage you to share your thoughts on the ending in English in the comments section. Until next time, keep your powder dry.